Good morning, good afternoon. I don't know what time you're listening. I'm Katie Tyler. Welcome to the Sociology Staffroom. We've got Vicki with us today. Hello, Vicki.
Hi.
Obviously, I'm going to introduce you. You're the subject lead for Key Stage 4 Humanities for Tutors U. So we're going to pick your brains. I know you do stuff for geography as well, but we're going to pick your brains in regards to Sociology GCSE. So are you right with me picking your brains, first of all?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm just sort of thinking about. I personally, as was myself, I've taught GCSE sociology for about 18 years. Actually, this first year I'm not. And maybe you might encourage me to come back to it or not. It's something I just paused for the time being. But was thinking about sort of those people that haven't taught GCSE sociology before and obviously teach A-level sociology, but they're thinking of bringing this into their sort of, I don't know, their curriculum offer for sociology. What sort of things are, like some of the teachers, I know some of their reservations might be, and I know this was one of my reservations, was thinking, well, is it too similar to the A level? Will the students get bored if they took it at A level and at GCSE? Obviously, it's just you're one person that has one view on the GCSE sociology. But what are your sort of views as someone that sort of subject leads for that in its similarities and differences in regards to its relationship to A-level sociology?
Well, I think with a GCSE Sociology, the two exam boards that actually offer it have the same 4 compulsory units. So all students do families and education in the first year, and then we all do crime and social stratification in the second year. So there is quite a lot of overlap. So, for example, this last couple of weeks, I've been writing an Instagram post for A-level sociology, and a lot of it, I'm thinking, oh God, this is stuff that I taught at GCSE. But obviously, with the A-level sociology, you do have the optionality, so you can choose to. I think education is compulsory, isn't it? And crime and deviance is compulsory, but you can choose not to teach families. You can choose not to teach stratification. So there is repetition. It obviously is. The content is far less heavy at GCSE, and you can view it two ways. You can either view it as having providing a really good base and a good foundation for A level, or a nice sort of introduction, and then you just mix it up in at A level by choosing different subjects. So I know certainly I've seen on our Tutor for You Facebook page, actually, people asking that same question that you mentioned, and people in the advice in the comments box saying, well, we used to do this, and what we've now done is we've decided to swap families and households, and we now teach global development instead, because obviously it means that it's less repetitious. And I guess the argument would be that if you decided that you wanted to teach families, you wanted to teach all the things they taught at GCSE because they've got a really good basis for it, then you are at risk of boring your students, like, death by repetition, and essentially teaching the same topics for 4 years across 2 exam courses is a bit much, isn't it? But I do think it does give a really good a really broad, nice introduction. It means that those of you who teach A-level sociology are not starting off with students in year 12 who perhaps haven't really chosen the most appropriate course for them, haven't realised that sociology at A-level is really demanding, and they sort of view it as a new, quite exciting subject that wasn't on offer at their high school. Whereas obviously if they have taught it at high school, they're more their expectations of the workload and just how demanding it is a subject I think are much more realistic. And then perhaps, I guess, maybe you don't get so many students that are dropping out, perhaps more students that the course is appropriate for.
Yeah, it's highlighted some really good. But they're the things that I've experienced. Definitely, I think at sort of GCSE, I know before I taught it at GCSE, my A level numbers were very healthy, and then I think when a combination of factors, I think the GCSE meant that the students didn't feel like they wanted to necessarily take it A level because of
Yeah.
maybe the realization of the workload. So therefore, like you said, you had more students that had the expectations and they were sort of set in place rather than, oh, let's just do something because it's just different and interesting, and almost become the sort of fourth subject choice
Yeah.
for students. But then obviously you've got the risk of, lots of GCSE, and if you like A-level teaching, potentially that can be decreased in the amount of the classes you have. There's also something I wanted to sort of touch upon, which is sort of the myths around it. And I think you sort of mentioned it when you talked about the hard workload. I myself have sort of witnessed that myself. There's sort of a myth around what GCSE sociology is. I think if it's not sold appropriately at the first start, there is potential problems that students just think it's a lot of discussion and a lot of debates. What are
Yeah.
your sort of views on that, and how do we overcome that? Because
Well,
you want to have that engagement, and obviously we've had previous guests that said obviously is so important into learning. But yeah, myths. How do we overcome them?
That's my first one. So when I was making a few notes this morning about the things that we were going to talk about, the main one I've said here that is people just view it as not being rigorous, and it's absolute rubbish. It's such a rigorous subject. I think it's got really massive content. I think the concepts are really tricky. You've got things like key studies that you've got to remember. So students have really got to apply their knowledge, haven't they, to be able to access those top bands in those high marker questions. It's an essay-based subject. So I know that certainly when I introduced it to my previous school, about 5 years ago now, the kids, we started off with all the nice sort of socialization, the norms and values, the culture stuff that the kids really find fascinating. Then you start bringing in a bit of theory and they're like, oh, what is this? And then, you give them the first 12 marker and they're sort of horrified. They don't expect it to be an essay-based subject. And what I found in the past, like kids going, oh, well, actually, we just thought it was a bit like PSHE. And because they see the exam content, they see all the topic content, they think, oh, well, that sounds interesting. We're talking about poverty, we're going to talk about this and this. So I think that's my main myth. I mean, and it's constantly changing, isn't it? Although, we do, and we've talked about this a lot as a subject team. There is a risk of just trotting out the same old boring, really old studies, aren't there? And obviously some of our main things that we do have to talk about are quite outdated now. But it is a constantly changing discipline. If we think about sort of the last few years with COVID and the cost of living crisis, that's all really relevant, isn't it? And all it's stuff that's really, really relevant to the kids. I also think it is highly valued, and I know certainly there are some people that are a bit sniffy about it, and I know certainly maybe in the independent sector it's perhaps not offered quite so much as in the state sector, but it is a highly valued subject. I think it is just as challenging as geography, which is my other subject that I taught for years and years. I think it's just as challenging as history, and I think so that's the main bugbear of me is that people think it's easy and students sort of hop onto the course thinking it's going to be a doddle and, like you said, the fourth option choice because they weren't really sure what it involved.
Yeah, no, I think that is. I think it's a struggle for a lot of the sociologists, whether it's doing it at GCSE or A level. I think I could get in a whole discussion about that around sort of the parity of STEAM between subjects, and I feel like I want to go on a bit of a rant about that.
Yeah,
but I think there's sort of a definite sort of assumption that particularly sociology lacks that rigor, which actually, as we know as sociology teachers, that's not the case. And sometimes it doesn't help when sometimes the grade boundaries, I'm trying to be very diplomatic as possible, are sometimes significantly lower. And then for those subjects, and then that obviously sometimes sends that message to those students, or you can just sort of hop onto these schools. I know it's not the same for GCSE because you don't have to have those grades, but then some schools do have pathways, don't they? So they sort of say, students who are working at this level can do this, and those that are doing this can do this. So it's overcoming that. I actually personally felt that the GCSE sociology, in some ways, thinking about the notional student, is actually harder than the A level, because I think, when you're doing your A levels, you're doing 3 to 4 subjects and you're just drilling deeper. I mean, we're going to come and talk about it in a minute, is that 12 marker, but doing, four 12 markers is intense, for students. And like you said, the essay expectations are so
I think
high.
Even in the EduCast actually has 50 markers as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big ask, isn't it, for students, when you've already got, in that paper, you've already got a 12 marker, you've got 15 markers, you've got 8 markers as well. So I think, again, I think students often come in, they think it's going to be very much discussion based and fun. And obviously it is discussion is a hugely important part of sociology, which draws up its own problems that we can have a think about in a minute. But I think in terms of just having those students that perhaps choose it as their fourth option choice because they're not really sure what it is, then having this massive subject, this huge content that you've got these essay based that you've got to write in the exam, I think is really challenging. And like you say, much possibly more challenging than at A level, because at A level you've got a much smaller focus, you've got more time. And yeah, the
Yeah.
content for sociology is huge.
Yeah, and also as you were talking, I just thought about the ability as well, because obviously GCSE is truly mixed ability, isn't
Yeah,
it? You know, if you're working within the comprehensive sector, but then obviously at A level there would have been an expectation they've passed GCSEs to a certain level in order to get onto the A level programs. Obviously schools vary on what that cut off point, but they would have definitely got a level of literacy in order to do that. And if they haven't got their sort of certain GCSEs, maths and English have to be done again. Whereas at GCSE, you literally have, I mean, I can't see it on the screen, but you literally
yeah,
got that level.
yeah,
So my sort of question is, in a sort of, how do we overcome some of these challenges? How do we overcome the myth that it's just a doddle potentially, or it's just a discussion? And how do we overcome the challenge of truly, I mean, I have taught some truly mixed ability classes where students
yeah.
are
Same
so
here.
verbally strong, but they can't translate that to an essay.
I think it's a lot of sort of scaffolding, isn't it? But certainly, and I know that will kind of link a bit more when we talk about the 12 markers in a minute. But I started on my very first year. I think I was quite naive because I set sociology up as head of geography at the time, and I was just asked to set it up. And I made sure that my not subject knowledge was, bang on. I read up loads. I studied it a bit at university anyway, so I tried to get this really exciting course up and running, and it was great. The kids were really engaged, and the numbers were really good. But it was a bit of a shock to the system at just how difficult it was for those lower ability students. I had students with target grades of 4, probably in my low ones, but actually in reality, they were probably going to come out of the course with a 1 or a 2. And
Yeah,
then
I
I
had
actually had
targets of twos. Yeah.
yeah, students right at the other end with their targets of 9. So it's really difficult. So what I found the second year round, when I got my second cohort in, was just making sure from a really early sort of early October in year 10, get those essays in, start regularly for homework, give really good scaffolded answers. We would practice them using a visualizer at the desk, on my desk, obviously on the board, showing sort of, using sentence structure strips, sentence starters, all sorts of things there to try and scaffold. I think that one of the other things that I think students really struggle with is the perspective. So think they find it quite dry anyway, particularly when you're coming back 4 topics and you're still talking about what Marxist thought about this, what did Durkheim say about this, and I think students find that quite dry. So I think obviously bringing that in, trying to find a way of doing it in a trying to make it as interesting as you possibly can. But also, one of the things that I think I found for that was the use of who said what, so sort of little matching activity. So you've got the structure strips trying to get kids used to writing really long answers to begin with, but also lots of retrieval practice really early on. So yeah, like I say, matching pairs is quite a favourite of mine. So who had the warm bath theory, and that sort of thing, that works quite well with students. And I noted down here is actually one of the things that I started off doing really early on was making sure that at the end of every topic, each child had this nice A3 sheet that was sort of compare and contrast who thought what for every topic. So again, it was like an overview, which was really useful, because I think that probably one of the biggest challenges, apart from students taking it, not really knowing what it is the fact that there's some really tricky concepts, those perspectives that students get really confused about, and having it all on one nice sort of thing that they've written and they can own, I think is quite a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's getting that abstract knowledge to making it more concrete for them is so
Yeah,
important. Definitely, like that overview. And I think there's always a debate on when do you bring in those essay structures. Do you do them early on so they get used to it, or do you do
yeah,
paragraph by paragraph? There's a debate out there about when do you start setting essays. Do you do them just in lesson time? Do you do them outside of lesson time? And I think it's just knowing your group of students and what works for them,
yeah,
and
definitely.
what's your why. Sometimes yes, they're not going to. They might spend longer on homework doing their essays, and they won't be able to do that in an actual exam conditions. But then for some of our students, they need that time to
Yeah,
cognitively really unpick. I mean, to say unpick those sort of literacy skills that they potentially might not have.
yeah, agree.
I think it's partly, I think you were saying as well, with those myths, is that, I mean, how do you feel about the recruitment process? I mean, would you set out your stall initially to those students saying, look, are you willing to work hard?
Yeah,
This is a
definitely.
literacy based subject, so that students know straight away, well, actually, I don't really like writing essays. That's not
Yeah,
really for me. I quite like sort of short exact answers sort of thing, and I don't really want to sort of compare and contrast in that same way. Would that be important as well?
So definitely. So when I've done open evening in the past, I've had the course content. I've had like all the lovely reasons why you should embrace the subject, but I've also had like students' books for my current year 10s and year 11s books. I might have a selection of those so students can have a look through and just see what it does entail. Obviously, the textbooks are quite wordy as well, aren't they? So that's always quite useful. Making sure that parents are really aware that it is a good subject. And at the school that I've just left, I taught for a year, didn't actually teach sociology there. But it had just been introduced as a subject, and I was talking to a geography class in one afternoon, and this lad who does hardly any writing had said to me, "Oh, I'm choosing sociology, miss. I think it'll be really good for me." And I sort of said, well, actually, it's lots and lots of writing. He went, "Oh, it's just talking, isn't it?" I was like, "Really isn't." So I think it is really important to make sure that when you are setting out your stall, you are really honest, that you're not just trying to recruit and get your numbers up. Because actually, at the end of the day, if you get your numbers up and it's full of students who the course is not appropriate for and have chose it because they think it's going to be interesting but actually don't want to do the work, then 2 years later, you've got to explain those results, haven't you, to SLT in an autumn review, and that's not fun.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Because you want to engage as many students as possible, one for your
Yeah,
numbers, but also sociology is such an important subject to get those critical thinking skills in place,
definitely.
irrespective of student skills. But at the same time, if students don't realise there's essays, it's up to them to make that choice. And I think some of if it's, I remember when I was early on in my career, I just wanted loads of students in my
Yeah,
class,
same here.
and I didn't really tell them. And then I get to the class and I go, "Oh, I didn't realise I had to write essays," and I was like, "Oh, sorry, like I thought it
Well,
was just
perfect.
you'd know
Too late
that."
now. I've got you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, like there was that amount of movement at GCSE in the first 2 weeks, and I was like, "Oh, actually, I should have said that a lot earlier on because I was so
Yeah.
keen just to get the numbers." And not everyone likes it. Like I'm trying to think of a subject that would be really awful for me to probably be art or something like that. And if I didn't realise I had to, draw, I was like, "Oh, so you do
You've
know
actually
that,"
got
but
to be good at painting. Okay.
yeah, yeah. I didn't realise that. Paint by numbers is not good enough, sort of thing. But yeah, definitely those skills. Obviously, the big one is we've talked about essays, and I know that both examples offer that. You've talked about how you do that through scaffolding. Are there any top tips? Because I know I've seen on the Facebook pages and other sort of sources. How do we teach this? You know, uh, the essay. I'm going to go with the 12 marker as such, but I
Yeah.
don't. I'm not going to lie. I don't know enough about the sort of the other sort of 15 marker. But is there sort of a top tip in a way to address it? Like people
So,
throw away peel paragraphs, and write
um,
two or
so one of the
yeah.
things that I've just done quite recently for Teach for You actually is I've actually just made this great big sort of 12 marker resource. And one of the reasons I wanted to do it, so obviously it's a useful resource for students and teachers, but also just to get my head back into kind of what the structure of these big 12 markers are. So obviously there are four on each paper, so they're quite, they are really
Yeah.
quite demanding. For AQA, I think that it's the advantage that we have there is that they're always discussed questions, so therefore they are
Mm.
relatively easy for students to prepare for. So it's normally a discussion question about what the different sociologists would, they have a statement that says to what extent or how far would sociologists agree with this statement. So it's quite a nice, easy one to prepare that way. So what I would say, essentially, you're looking to present 3 paragraphs discussing what each perspective would say. So you might start off with the Marxist, and normally I would say start off with the perspective which is most related to the thing you're talking about. So if, for example, the question was all about to how far would sociologists agree that the UK is too dependent on benefits? Obviously, you're going to start off with a new right perspective, aren't you? Because they're the ones that have got the biggest, the most vocal about that. So you start off with the paragraph, just sort of agreeing essentially with the statement, backing up with examples, obviously trying to get some perspectives in if you can. I mean, there are times where I think it is a bit more difficult to get perspectives in because actually the question might want you to talk about education, for example, but they might want you to talk about in-school factors and things. So therefore, not every paragraph is perspective. It's other stuff as well. But what I would say at the end of each paragraph is it's really important to have like a little evaluative comment. So, for example, you might, if you've talked all about what the new right think about the sort of the welfare dependency and the benefit cultures, you might then say, however, Marxists would say, and then, you know, say what they would say. And then that could lead then into your next paragraph about Marxists. So I think it's really important to get that evaluation in throughout, because obviously that 12 marker is really evaluative, and those students are not going to get into the high bands if they're not presenting a decent evaluative argument throughout. And then right at the end, because you've been evaluating, then your conclusion is more of a sort of a quick summary. So overall, I think that this group of sociologists would agree, however, you know, X, Y, and Z wouldn't, and they would think that this is more important. And I think because they all follow that exact sort of, you know, that exact discuss thing, I think it's a real benefit of the AQA spec. Whereas Educast, some people believe that Educast is a little bit easier to access, and the questions are sort of, you know, worded in a way that makes it a bit easier for students. Personally, I've taught both, and I don't really think there's much difference between it. But you've got Educast have got their 15 markers, which are discuss or do you agree questions. They also have 9 markers in stratification, sort of randomly. They don't have them anywhere else, and they're always discuss or do you agree. You've got 8 marker explain questions, and then you've got 12 markers for research methods, where that one's pretty easy actually, because with a 12 marker for research methods, you are just weighing up the pros and cons of a particular research method. So that's quite an easy one to present. So, you know, strengths and weaknesses of questionnaires, for example, and then backing it up with some theory or you know, a study that's used it. So I think, yeah.
It's like we're saying, like obviously, it's almost like the 12 markers or the sort of 15 markers. Obviously, the 15 markers have got sort of more breadth in the way that they're questioned, but then the 12 markers have a set formula as such. But it's making sure that those students are doing that evaluation, and and actually, definitely. I think it's even that explicit evaluation has to come in. It's almost like feels like you're building up for that A level already, without that sort of maybe sort of that depth, because obviously there's less names you need to know, and the evaluation doesn't have to be as deep, but it has to be there, which is quite a nice stone. But for some of those skills, I always find students it's really defining what evaluation means in sociology, because I think it means something slightly different. I remember, like, I've personally never taught geography, although I have covered some classes, and they used to love TEAL evaluation. Is that right? TEAL?
That's not. That might be something with A level. It's certainly not something that I've particularly geography with GCSE.
Yeah, but the point I was thinking of is that every subject looks at it slightly differently, and they have certain components to make up their evaluation. Like I know in history, you've got to look at the origin of something and the inference, and so there's all these little components. And I think sometimes it's sort of assumed that students know this, but it's really sort of time to sort of break that down and what that means and what that looks like at GCSE Sociology. And again, revisiting that at A level. The one that I also found. Oh, sorry, go for it.
I think that's the same with all command words, because I was talking. A few weeks ago, I presented a CPD course down in London for GCSE Geography, and we were talking about this because with geography, described questions are essentially say what you see, nothing else. But certainly with the Educast spec, when I first started teaching that, I became really aware really quickly that described questions actually, and not just described questions, they want you to bring in and back, you know, describe something and back it up with an example. So you are explaining something. So I think it is really important for all subjects, isn't it, to know, or for students to know exactly what your command words mean in the context of your subject. Which therefore I think then makes GCSE even more challenging, because they've got to do that for sort of 10 different subjects, haven't they? Whereas at A level, again, they're doing it for 3 or 4.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I was thinking of sort of the 4 marker, written down the 4 marker. And I can't remember because I haven't got a paper right in front of me at the moment, but the 4 marker looks slightly different. I know that you were saying that there's a sort of similarity with the 12 markers, but I know the 4 markers, they can be a little bit challenging in the sense that they're slightly different, aren't they? In the sense you've got one with the name, one with the method in context, and then you've just got the straightforward. And I remember saying to students, there's quite like if you think about the question, sometimes it's asking you around a question that's previous. So if you've got that wrong, you've got the second bit wrong as well. Like if it's like
I think so. They tend to be at GCSE. They tend to all start off with identify and explain one, and then it'll be one reason, one way, one method, or something. And they're 4 marks. So you get like AO1 for is your identifying, and then there's 3 marks for AO2. But I think these are really tricky, because actually there's a potential to choose obviously more than one, even though it says 1. And I think it's really difficult for students who are, 15, 16 to write one thing and get 4 marks for it. So if it's, explain one reason why ethnic minority students may underachieve at school, for example. There's a whole range of things that a student can write about, but obviously they've got to pick one, haven't they? And then it has to be the right one they're picked. They might decide halfway through the answer, actually, I haven't really chosen the right one here. I think I'm going to start again because I know more about this.
And also sometimes it's not the one mentioned in the items. So for some
Yeah.
students, it might be the one they know, and they're like, oh, it's in the item now.
But I think it's quite an odd thing. I mean, I think I can kind of see why AQA are doing it, because it obviously makes it more rigorous, doesn't it? It's the more that upping the challenge. But then when you look at the mark scheme, so you've got the indicative content, you might have 3 bullet points of things that they could write about. For each bullet point underneath, there's a little sentence about what they could write. But I was like, well, even in your mark scheme, you haven't actually developed and shown what a good answer should look like. So then it's all level marked, isn't it? Which I think, I think students find level marked answers for 4 markers quite difficult, and the mark scheme is not very student friendly. So I think, although they always start off with identify and explain, and that one thing, it's a bit of a minefield with students. So again, it's just practicing, isn't it? And I was thinking about this earlier, about doing some sort of stepping stones activities, or maybe some scramble sentences, like some of the things that we use in revision blasts would be quite a good thing to do with students to help them sort of scaffold those 4 markers. So then obviously after a while you can take that support out and they'll become much more independent with them.
I think that's sort of a constant theme there. It's offering that support for those GCSE students, isn't it? That you sort of gradually, and I think eventually by the time they get into year 11, that scaffolding isn't needed, hopefully, because obviously they're going into the exam. But I think that just shows the importance of scaffolding at GCSE. That if you're an A-level practitioner at the moment, you might do a little bit of scaffolding in year 12, particularly if you're broaching different style of questions potentially. But it's not as, I think it's so essential at GCSE because of that scope of ability of students, and their motivation for doing it. Like there's lots of different reasons why students do it. And a lot of them, some of those students might think to themselves, oh, I didn't know what's, like we said earlier, didn't know it's going to be like that. Are there any sort of final top tips for those people that are either thinking of bringing it in they haven't before, someone like me who's not got it in at the moment? I've started a new school and I've obviously got the A level, but I haven't brought back the GCSEs yet.
I think
any top tips?
It depends on the context of you yourself. I mean, when I brought it in, I hadn't taught sociology at all. I'd done it at university as part of my my geography degree. I had to do a second subject in my first year, and I loved it. I thought it was really interesting. And it just happened to be that my school wanted to bring in some more bucket 3 subjects for Progress 8 schools. So I said, well, actually, I would really like to do that. So I think it is really important that obviously your subject knowledge is up to date and it's good, because I think you have to have really good knowledge, because obviously there's a huge amount of discussion involved, and obviously you need to have that knowledge anyway for teaching, but in sociology discussion is important, and I think that you have to be confident in your knowledge to be able to organise and manage those discussions yourself. So I found at my previous school, we had a timetable revamp half of the year, and they put one of my year 10 classes on one of their 5 lessons a fortnight on my day off. I was like, this is really helpful. So a non-specialist then had to come and teach that lesson, and she used to find it an absolute nightmare. I'd give her the lessons, several days in advance, so she knew exactly what she's doing. Generally, I'd try and make it as simple as possible, but occasionally there might be a discussion, and it would terrify her because she didn't have the subject knowledge to be able to sort of run and manage that discussion really carefully. I think what I also would say is, for those people that are trying to set it up and haven't taught sociology before, it is obviously, we've said it's a challenging subject, but it's also a subject where there are some topics that are really sensitive, and that some of the things that you talk about when in your lessons, your students might have much more awareness of than you. And I was really aware of that. So things like if you're teaching about poverty, for example, you might have kids in your class that are, food bank users, are really struggling, maybe working a part-time job out of school because they need to bring some money into the household. Obviously, divorce is another one. Domestic violence, I think, is really. So I think it's really important that you are really sensitive about your subjects when you're writing your lessons. Make sure you're aware of those. And what I would say in terms of advice for that one is that speak to your pastoral team. So when I first set it up, I made sure that I spoke to the pastoral team and the safeguarding lead, to find out, or not really to find out about students, because in some cases they can't give me that information, but I would essentially hand over a list of topics that we would be discussing at some point in the year. And I said, look, these are my class lists. I really could do with knowing if there are any students that this is going to be problematic for. And then, depending on, I guess, your relationship with the kids, we had an agreement in place that if they needed to leave the classroom because whatever we were talking about was too upsetting for them, they could. And it didn't have to be like a hand up, and we would know that was going. It can either be, you could tell that student that agreement's in place. We can get the pastoral team to. During COVID, actually, we went through obviously home-based learning, didn't we? But we also got, when we came back from COVID, just the point where every single lesson I ever taught was just put on Google Classroom, just in case kids were away, which was most lessons, wasn't it? So it all, and I thought actually that's quite a good thing to do. If you sort of pop it on in the morning, students can have a quick look at the Google Classroom and see what you are discussing, and if it is anything that they think, oh, I can't be dealing, that's too close to the bone for me, then they could come and have a chat with you or just excuse themselves. So I think it's one of those things that people forget. My first year, I didn't really think about it. I just wanted to write a lovely curriculum that was going to engage the kids. And it was only sort of my second year I started thinking a bit more about these sort of the sensitivities of the topics, and just, I don't know, sort of how you manage sort of things that kids come out with. And I think also the other one that I would say is it's quite tricky to manage classroom discussions, because you do have some students dominating entirely, and you also have to be quite aware that some of the students that don't try and dominate your discussions might have some views that perhaps you find a bit questionable, or you might want to try and not necessarily shut down, but kind of rein them in a bit. So certainly when there's questions about the benefit system, so they can be quite vocal about stereotypes. It's often that echo chamber, isn't it, of what their parents think, and that can be quite tricky to manage. Feminism, I've had boys in the past that are really shouty about that, and there's all these sorts of things that when you're setting up the course you have to think about. It isn't just about writing a curriculum. It's a topic that's rigorous, but it's a subject that's really sensitive and has some issues that you might not find in other subjects.
Oh, definitely. I think there's such valid points. I mean, there are different things that I've considered, and I know we've got some talking in a couple of weeks with me about feminism and how we sort of teach that effectively. And I think as well, particularly at GCSE, maybe not so much at A-level, not to say that students don't dominate lessons or discussions, and maybe have different ways of presenting their information that might not be as effective as they probably would want it to be. I think at GCSE you've got more scope for that because of the fact that they are a lot younger. In a sense, they're sort of just out of year 9, coming into sort of when their first topic might be family unit, where they're talking about divorce and different family diversity, and talking about maybe sort of same-sex families. And so it's really thinking about not just the curriculum offer, but maybe some of the sensitivity issues, and also the maturity of the students, and thinking about, well, how are we going to present this so they feel safe enough to be able to engage that material, but also making students feel they can contribute without feeling judged, because obviously it's important. That's the importance, isn't it, of the critical thinking in sociology, that yes, some of those points are questionable, they may be or may not be, don't know what they're talking about in the lesson, but giving them the opportunity to go, well, why are you thinking that, and so they can work through that, because that's part of it as well, isn't it, that actually that might be the first time
saying, no, you're wrong.
And it's just the right way of doing it. And I definitely think sociology is different from PSHE now. I think that's where the advantage is. I think sometimes because we have got the theory, I think that sometimes gives us that detachment without it. I think this, or you think this. I sometimes think the layer of the theory allows that as a lens, so it doesn't feel so personal, that maybe PSHE potentially could have. But yes, definitely something. I know for myself, I do email, the same as you, the safeguard lead, just saying, we're just about to do this, just to let you know, and I'm doing this with this year group, just in case something arises, and so they know. And also just from a Googling perspective, I got this with I teach criminology as well in the past, and I used to have the safeguard lead going, we've had a group of students Googling, I don't know, female genital mutilation. And And actually, I was like, oh gosh, actually, I should just tell you what we're looking at the moment so they know that's what we're covering. But yes, really powerful sort of tool. You're sort of using your school community to support you with that as well. So some really sort of valid points, and I really appreciate your time. Lots to think about there for those people that either are bringing in GCSE or those people thinking of sort of further embedding their GCSE sort of curriculum, or someone like me who hasn't brought it back in as yet, but maybe bring it in. I'm not sure. I have to think about it. But thank you for your time, Vicki, and
You're welcome.
looking forward to seeing those GCSE resources you mentioned as well, sort of the 12 mark plan. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.